Coming back for some brand new breaking news. MS Now has just learned that FBI Director Kash Patel may be out of a job in the coming months. 3 people with knowledge of the situation say President Trump and his top aides have grown tired of Patel and the unflattering headlines he's been generating recently, including using a government jet to visit his girlfriend and enlisting a SWAT team as her security detail. Joining us, MS Now Justice and Intelligence reporter Ken Delanian and MS Now White House reporter Laura Barone-Lopez. Both of them broke this story along with Carol Lenning.
Well, Katie, I should say, first of all the qualifiers apply here. With Donald Trump and personnel decisions, you never actually know exactly what's going on. But we are being told that Kash Patel, the FBI director, is on increasingly thin ice. And the president is considering replacing him by the end of the year with Andrew Bailey.
The courtroom goes quiet. Not the ordinary silence, but the kind that presses down on your chest. A federal judge leans forward, jaw tight, eyes fixed on Donald Trump. Court staff stop moving. Lawyers fall silent. In that heavy moment, the threat lands. Because just seconds earlier, Trump didn't merely argue the law, he crossed a line, and everyone in the room felt it. The clock starts ticking almost immediately. Prosecutors retreat behind closed doors as the judge issues a stunning order. Trump's recordings must be turned over. Private conversations, unfiltered words, audio Trump never believed would see daylight, recordings that could flip this case from political spectacle into serious criminal danger, where consequences aren't measured in headlines, but in charges. The legal risk is severe and unmistakable. If a judge determines a threat was made, that's not just civil contempt with fines or warnings. It's criminal contempt, which can bring prosecution and even jail time. And if those recordings reveal intent to intimidate or interfere, the exposure escalates to obstruction of justice, a felony that strips away privilege, power, and political armor. Inside Trump's legal team, fear sets in. Faces pale, hands shake. Lawyers whisper urgently, knowing loyalty is now colliding with self-preservation. Do they shield the man they've defended for years or protect themselves before the ground gives way beneath them? This judge has already made his patience clear. After months of delays and procedural games, December the 2nd was meant to move things forward. Instead, it detonated. When Trump implied there would be consequences if sentencing continued, it wasn't brushed aside. Judges don't ignore intimidation. They document it, preserve it, and act on it. That's why the recordings matter so much. Words matter. Tone matters. Timing matters. A single sentence can separate protected speech from a criminal threat. And once those tapes are released, there is no erasing context, no spinning tone, no walking it back. Now the pressure tightens. Trump's allies face a brutal internal question: stand with defiance or distance themselves before the fallout hits. Because if the recordings confirm what the judge already suspects, this case doesn't slow down. It accelerates. The threat may have lasted only seconds, but what's captured on those recordings could decide everything.
Accused of mishandling or misusing government funds, misusing government planes, a version of corruption, and I guess this would fall into the same category. If you're talking about the SWAT team and the using the private jet, at the very least, just a misuse or an unseemly use of government property.
The former Attorney General of Missouri, who is acting now as co-deputy FBI director, along with Dan Bongino. And it's for all the reasons that you just said and others, the use of taxpayer resources, the flying his girlfriend around on the FBI jet.
Welcome back to Reports on States, your trusted source for breaking political news. Before we dive in, make sure you subscribe to our channel, Reports on States, and hit the bell icon so you never miss updates on high-stakes political developments. Today, we're diving into a courtroom showdown that could reshape the trajectory of one of the most controversial figures in recent American history.
The tension was palpable in the federal courthouse. Accusations of misusing government funds, unauthorized use of government aircraft, and deploying elite security personnel for personal matters had already placed this former president under intense scrutiny. Allegations included flying a companion on an FBI jet and assigning a SWAT team as a private security detail, actions that, at minimum, represented misuse of government resources and raised serious ethical and legal questions. Inside the courtroom, the stakes were immediate, personal, and unforgiving. Witnesses, clerks, and lawyers were all present as the situation escalated beyond procedural delays and legal wrangling. Then, according to reports, a direct threat was issued. In a moment that stunned the room, the defendant reportedly told the presiding judge, "If you sentence me, there will be consequences." That statement, clear and unambiguous, was captured in real time by court staff and witnesses, creating a legal and ethical earthquake. Instead of intimidating the judge, the threat had the opposite effect. The judge, clearly fed up with delays and stalling tactics, responded decisively. He ordered the immediate release of critical recordings that had been fought over vigorously and that the defendant had tried desperately to keep under wraps. These recordings, now officially part of the case, reportedly feature discussions that could contradict public claims of innocence and highlight actions linked to the charges at hand. The courtroom atmosphere intensified as the threat itself was documented in the official record, transforming an attempt at intimidation into a tangible piece of evidence for obstruction of justice. What was meant to suppress scrutiny instead amplified it. Legal experts watching this unfold noted that this single moment could open new avenues for federal charges, reinforcing a broader pattern in which intimidation tactics fail against established judicial authority.
Observers in the room described a dramatic scene, shouting, gesturing, and repeated interruptions that drew security closer. The judge issued formal warnings of contempt, signaling that the court would not tolerate further disruption. Rather than bending under pressure, the judiciary demonstrated an unwavering commitment to law and procedure. Federal judges, aware of similar threats faced by colleagues, from bomb threats and swatting attacks to harassment of family members, clearly understood the importance of standing firm. By the end of the hearing, what had been intended as a moment of fear and control had transformed into a courtroom victory for accountability. The recordings were released, the threat was preserved on record, and the legal process advanced without interference, creating new momentum against the defendant. Analysts have noted the irony. Each attempt to intimidate judges has historically resulted in more documented evidence and stricter judicial responses. Now, the recordings that the defendant worked hardest to suppress were publicly accessible, marking a turning point in both legal and political terms.
The courtroom drama didn't just reveal procedural outcomes, it exposed character, strategy, and miscalculations. Federal judges across the country are now taking note. Intimidation, threats, and attempts to manipulate the legal system will not be tolerated. The rule of law, in this case, has asserted itself clearly, demonstrating that no individual, regardless of past position or political influence, is above scrutiny or accountability. And with that, the stage is set for the next chapter. Evidence is out, legal exposure is mounting, and the consequences of a single courtroom threat are just beginning to ripple outward. Thank you for watching this segment. Don't forget to subscribe to Reports on States to stay updated with the latest legal and political developments. As the recordings hit the court record, the implications began to unfold rapidly. Legal analysts immediately pointed out that these tapes could provide prosecutors with new leverage. Every word captured, from discussions about alleged misuse of government resources to statements that may contradict sworn claims, became a piece of a growing legal puzzle. Federal law treats threats to a judge very seriously. Making such threats in a courtroom can constitute obstruction of justice, a federal offense that carries severe penalties. What had been a verbal outburst now became a formal entry in the legal ledger, strengthening the case against the defendant. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was tense. Court staff described a scene unlike any routine hearing. Security officers were on alert, anticipating further disruptions. Lawyers shuffled papers frantically, whispering strategies as the judge maintained strict control over proceedings. The defendant's outburst, which was meant to intimidate, instead exposed him to increased scrutiny. Every gesture, every interruption, every shouted comment was documented in the official record, effectively creating a blueprint of behavior that prosecutors could now use to demonstrate intent and pattern. Beyond the immediate courtroom, the political consequences were equally significant. Allies and advisors who had previously defended these actions were now navigating a delicate balance between loyalty and legal liability. Public perception was also shifting. Whereas threats or intimidation might have been dismissed in previous political arenas, the judicial system treated them as tangible evidence. Analysts noted that this scenario was rare. It combined procedural law, criminal exposure, and public scrutiny in a single, high-stakes setting. The recordings themselves added layers of complexity. They reportedly contained discussions of the alleged misuse of government planes, taxpayer resources, and private security deployments. These are not minor administrative errors. In legal terms, they could constitute official misconduct or abuse of office, particularly when taxpayer-funded resources were involved. If corroborated, such evidence would allow prosecutors to pursue additional counts, including fraud, misappropriation of government property, and potential conspiracy charges. Each recording segment was analyzed for context, timing, and corroboration with other documents in the case.
Meanwhile, judges across the federal judiciary were reportedly observing the case closely. Threats directed at judges, whether explicit or implied, are treated as systemic risks. Bomb threats, swatting incidents, and harassment directed at judicial families have been documented in prior rulings, making the protection of court officers and family members a priority. By standing firm and releasing the recordings, the presiding judge not only reinforced the rule of law in this instance, but also sent a message to colleagues nationwide: intimidation will not deter justice. The ripple effects were already starting. The defendant's attempts to delay proceedings or suppress evidence were thwarted. Every action taken to intimidate the judiciary only accelerated scrutiny, tightened security measures, and increased the likelihood of additional charges. Analysts noted a clear pattern emerging. For every attempt to control or manipulate the court, the legal system responded with speed and force. This pattern suggested that the defendant's usual playbook of pressure and threats was ineffective in a federal courtroom where documentation and procedure prevail. By the close of this session, the stakes were unmistakable. Evidence had been released, threats had been recorded, and the defendant's legal exposure was expanding. What had begun as an attempt to intimidate a judge had transformed into a public and permanent record of misconduct. Federal authorities were now empowered with new tools to pursue accountability, and the political and legal narrative was shifting rapidly. For those watching closely, it was clear. The courtroom had turned from a stage for disruption into a crucible for consequences. With the recordings now public, the pressure on the defendant intensified exponentially. Legal teams pored over every word, timestamp, and inflection, seeking both explanations and strategies to mitigate potential damage. Federal prosecutors, on the other hand, treated each clip as a roadmap, highlighting inconsistencies, potential admissions of misconduct, and any evidence that could demonstrate obstruction of justice. For context, obstruction under federal law, specifically 18 U.S.C. Paragraph 1503, can carry fines and imprisonment of up to 5 years, and when paired with misuse of government resources, the stakes rose even higher. The courtroom drama had transformed into a high-stakes legal chess match, with every move meticulously scrutinized. Inside the courtroom, tension remained electric. Security remained on high alert, with additional officers positioned to prevent any further disruptions. Witnesses and staff described the scene as surreal. Moments of silence punctuated by sudden outbursts, with the defendant gesturing and interrupting proceedings in ways that could now be used against him. The judge maintained an unwavering presence, calmly ensuring the release of recordings while emphasizing adherence to procedure and law. Every action was being documented, creating a permanent record that would influence not just this case, but potential future proceedings. The content of the recordings revealed more than just alleged misuse of planes or security personnel. Sources indicate that discussions included internal deliberations that could implicate multiple individuals in attempts to influence the judicial process. By speaking freely, and in some cases arrogantly, the defendant allegedly exposed motivations and intentions that could constitute criminal obstruction. Legal analysts emphasized that intent is critical in such cases. The tapes provided a direct window into mindset and planning, which prosecutors could leverage to strengthen the narrative of willful misconduct. Politically, the fallout was immediate. News outlets highlighted the irony. Threats intended to suppress evidence instead ensured its release. Social media erupted with commentary dissecting the implications, while political allies scrambled to address questions about judgment, legality, and credibility. Advisors who had previously supported the defendant were suddenly in crisis mode, calculating risk exposure for themselves while attempting damage control. Every press statement or public appearance risked contradicting statements in the recordings, further amplifying potential legal consequences. Judges across the federal system took note. Threats directed at the judiciary are treated not only as individual acts, but as systemic threats. Past incidents, ranging from bomb threats to swatting attacks against judicial families, underscore the seriousness with which courts respond. By refusing to be intimidated and releasing the recordings, the presiding judge not only advanced the legal process, but set a precedent. Intimidation will not derail judicial authority. This moment is now studied by legal professionals nationwide as an example of the judiciary's resilience against external pressures. Meanwhile, the defendant faced mounting internal conflict. Advisors reportedly urged restraint, lawyers cautioned against further outbursts, and political strategists attempted to contain narrative damage. Every decision now carried amplified consequences. Missteps, misstatements, or additional threats could trigger further legal exposure, potentially leading to new federal charges or sanctions. Analysts describe the situation as a domino effect. Once intimidation fails, the full weight of evidence, procedure, and judicial authority comes crashing down. By the end of this sequence, it was clear. The courtroom had shifted from a site of attempted dominance to a stage of accountability. The defendant's threat, initially intended to manipulate outcomes, had backfired spectacularly, reinforcing the principle that in the federal system, no one is above scrutiny. The recordings, once hidden, now shaped the trajectory of the case, underscoring the undeniable power of documented evidence. As the case progressed, the released recordings became central to understanding both the legal and political stakes. Analysts noted that they weren't just audio clips, they were evidence with multiple layers, demonstrating alleged misuse of government property, revealing private deliberations, and potentially showing intent to interfere with judicial proceedings. Federal law distinguishes between mere misstatements and deliberate obstruction, and these recordings appeared to cross that threshold. Experts cited 18 U.S.C. paragraph 1512, which criminalizes influencing, intimidating, or impeding federal officials, as highly relevant in interpreting the courtroom events. The courtroom, once a venue for procedural maneuvering, now became the epicenter of tangible legal peril. Inside the courthouse, the tension was almost cinematic. Security was tightened, anticipating both external threats and the defendant's potential outbursts. Court staff described scenes of nervous energy, attorneys whispering, cameras rolling, and every word meticulously recorded. The judge's demeanor was composed but resolute, ensuring that proceedings continued according to protocol while maintaining a firm stance on decorum. This atmosphere of controlled intensity highlighted the difference between political theater and judicial authority. The defendant's attempts at intimidation, once meant to delay or redirect proceedings, had inadvertently provided the court with further justification to assert control. Meanwhile, the political ramifications rippled outward. The recordings and documented threats challenged public narratives and reshaped media coverage. Commentators dissected every line, noting moments where the defendant's statements contradicted prior claims of innocence or downplayed alleged misuses of government funds. Allies scrambled to mitigate reputational damage, while opponents framed the situation as evidence of recklessness and disregard for the rule of law. Social media amplified the drama, creating a sense of immediacy and urgency that further pressured legal teams on both sides. The legal team for the defendant faced an unprecedented dilemma. With the threat officially on record and the recordings publicly accessible, every strategy had to account for potential federal scrutiny, additional charges, and political fallout. Lawyers had to carefully navigate public statements, courtroom motions, and evidence handling. Each misstep could be cited in court as further obstruction, and the risk of compounding legal exposure was real. Observers describe this as a pressure cooker scenario, where a single uncalculated move could escalate consequences dramatically. Judges nationwide took note of the broader significance. Threats toward the judiciary are not isolated incidents. They are systemic risks that challenge the integrity of the legal system. Bomb threats, swatting attacks, and harassment of family members in prior cases underscore the seriousness with which courts respond. By refusing to bow to intimidation, the presiding judge not only safeguarded the evidence, but reinforced the principle that federal judges must remain independent and fearless in the face of external pressure. This decision sent a clear signal across the judicial community. Attempts to manipulate outcomes through threats will be met with decisive action. By the end of this phase, the courtroom had shifted from a scene of potential chaos to a stage of accountability. The defendant's threat, once intended to intimidate, had become a critical piece of evidence. The recordings now functioned as both a legal and political catalyst, reshaping public perception and setting the stage for future courtroom developments. The stakes had never been higher, and the consequences of each action were becoming increasingly tangible. The narrative was clear. Intimidation had failed, evidence had prevailed, and the rule of law had asserted itself decisively. With the legal exposure mounting, attention turned to the implications of the recordings themselves. Analysts noted that the tapes could demonstrate not just isolated missteps, but a potential pattern of misconduct, including misuse of government resources, personal benefits derived from taxpayer-funded assets, and efforts to manipulate judicial outcomes. Each statement captured on these recordings could be cross-referenced with other documents, emails, and witness testimonies, creating a web of evidence that strengthened potential federal cases. Legal experts emphasized that patterns of behavior are often pivotal in proving intent, particularly in obstruction and misuse of office cases. The courtroom remained a pressure cooker environment. Security remained on high alert, anticipating both disruptions and external threats, as prior reports had shown judges in similar cases facing harassment, bomb threats, and swatting incidents. Inside, attorneys for both sides worked frantically, parsing the recordings, preparing motions, and anticipating every possible move. The defendant, aware of the recording's implications, reportedly struggled with internal conflict, balancing attempts to assert control with the knowledge that every statement was now evidence against him. Witnesses described a tense, almost cinematic scene, with legal staff moving quickly to document developments and the judge maintaining an unwavering presence. Politically, the situation created significant ripples. Media outlets began dissecting the content of the recordings, highlighting moments that contradicted prior statements of innocence or suggested misuse of taxpayer funds. Public perception shifted as analyses emphasized that threats intended to suppress evidence had instead ensured its release. Advisors scrambled to mitigate both legal and reputational damage, recognizing that the combination of courtroom documentation, public scrutiny, and media coverage made containment nearly impossible. Each new revelation amplified the stakes for the defendant, creating a high-pressure scenario with both immediate and long-term consequences. The judge's decision to release the recordings reinforced an important precedent. By refusing to allow intimidation to dictate the proceedings, the presiding judge not only maintained courtroom authority, but also ensured that justice followed the evidence rather than political pressure. Legal experts emphasized that this was a rare but clear demonstration of the judiciary's independence, a principle enshrined in the U.S. Constitution, which guarantees that no individual, regardless of political stature, can manipulate the legal process through threats or intimidation. Meanwhile, the recordings began influencing other investigations and proceedings. Federal prosecutors now had tangible evidence that could be used not just in this case, but potentially in related inquiries, expanding the legal footprint of the situation. Every new statement or revelation created further pressure, not just on the defendant, but on advisors, legal teams, and political allies. The unfolding scenario demonstrated a classic legal domino effect. Attempts at suppression and intimidation triggered release, documentation, and scrutiny, creating cascading consequences that extended far beyond the courtroom walls. By the conclusion of this segment, the stakes were unmistakably high. Evidence that had once been hidden was now fully public, legal exposure had intensified, and the political and personal ramifications were clear. The defendant's strategy had failed spectacularly, with threats backfiring and legal authority prevailing. With recordings released, threats documented, and momentum firmly in the hands of the judiciary, the path forward was fraught with potential consequences, ensuring that the next phase of the saga would be even more consequential. As the legal proceedings entered their next phase, the full weight of the released recordings became undeniable. Prosecutors meticulously referenced each segment, highlighting statements that potentially revealed misconduct, misuse of government resources, and efforts to influence judicial decisions. Legal scholars emphasized that this evidence was critical not only because of what was said, but because of the context. In a federal courtroom, under oath or during official proceedings, words carry exceptional legal weight. Combined with prior filings, emails, and other documentation, the recordings painted a compelling picture of potential obstruction and abuse of office. Inside the courtroom, tension remained palpable. The defendant appeared increasingly cornered, caught between the pressure of public scrutiny, legal strategy, and the knowledge that each outburst could be recorded and used against him. Security remained on high alert, a reminder that previous threats to judges and court staff had escalated beyond rhetoric into real-world hazards, including swatting, bomb threats, and harassment. The judge maintained absolute composure, carefully managing the proceedings, ensuring that decorum was upheld, and emphasizing the importance of the evidence now in play. Every procedural decision was deliberate, signaling that attempts at intimidation would be ineffective and potentially detrimental. The political and social ramifications were equally profound. Media coverage exploded with analysis, debate, and speculation. Analysts dissected each element of the recordings, highlighting moments that contradicted previous statements or revealed potential legal vulnerabilities. Public perception shifted as commentators emphasized that the attempt to suppress evidence had spectacularly failed, and the defendant's own actions had amplified the scrutiny. Advisors, legal teams, and political allies now had to navigate a landscape where every statement, decision, and public appearance could trigger further legal and reputational consequences. Judges across the federal system took note of the precedent set. By documenting threats, refusing intimidation, and ensuring the release of critical evidence, the presiding judge reinforced the independence and authority of the judiciary. This act was not only procedural but symbolic, signaling that threats and attempts to manipulate outcomes would meet decisive legal responses. For the federal judiciary, this moment underscored the principle that no individual, regardless of stature, can circumvent the law through intimidation. The recordings, the threats, and the courtroom decisions together became a case study in how the system resists coercion. Looking forward, the implications for the defendant were clear. Legal exposure had increased significantly, political credibility had been damaged, and every attempt to manipulate the process now risked compounding the consequences. New charges could emerge, evidence could continue to be introduced, and the ongoing documentation ensured that future proceedings would consider the pattern of intimidation and obstruction. Analysts described the situation as a domino effect, where each aggressive or reckless move only heightened scrutiny and accountability. In conclusion, the combination of threats, released recordings, and documented courtroom behavior illustrates a fundamental truth. The federal legal system is structured to withstand attempts at coercion, and every effort to intimidate judges can backfire dramatically. The recordings, now public, will shape not only the current case but also potential related investigations, creating lasting legal and political consequences. The judiciary, standing firm, demonstrated the primacy of law over intimidation, and the unfolding events serve as a reminder that accountability cannot be avoided through threats or posturing. We thank our viewers for following this in-depth coverage, and make sure to subscribe to our channel Reports on States to stay updated on every new development. This story is far from over, and the coming weeks could bring even more revelations as the legal process continues.